On this DM Gives Inspiration, we're going to be talking about battle mats and battle maps. And what I mean by a battle map is the actual tactical miniatures board that you create, draw, or purchase for your adventure in order to help your players visualize the field. And this episode is not a declaration that battle maps are better than theater of the mind. Both have their own place. A piece of scratch paper, a cave roughly drawn, circles with the player's initials inside them, and arrows that note where they are going, scratchings out where they had been. In general, you'll find with experience that the smaller your group is, the more they respond to theater of the mind, because their turns come around often, and it's easy for them to picture where everyone is on the battlefield. With bigger groups, and in particular visual learners, a miniatures board can help out a lot to make sure the battle goes smoothly and everyone knows what's going on at all times. That's not to say that visual learners are a burden on your wallet either. You do not need exact miniatures. You do not have to have a large beholder official miniature in order to perform that battle. Old action figures, pipe cleaners folded over, tokens and player pieces from other games all work fabulously. In fact, once you go down the road of making everything official miniature, your players will be a little disturbed when things aren't official. You have everything perfectly laid out, have spent all you can on all your miniatures, and one day you want to run a lizard folk instead of a kobold, and you use a kobold miniature for that lizard folk. Their brains are going to bust. I'd say stay in the dirty territory when it comes to miniatures in the first place. And for my own home games, I use a Chessex wet erase mat or battle mat. I have one that is 26 inches by 26 inches, so a smaller square, and then a 4-foot by 3-foot edition. Sorry to any international listeners for my US Customs Imperial System usage. The reason I love this mat and recommend it is because once it is dried, hands can move freely over it. You have to get out the water and do a little bit of scrubbing to actually get those marks you make, those dungeons you draw, off the map. I have used large dry erase boards in the past. They can get rather tiring with the amount of hover hand you have to perform, and even a miniature sliding across the board will ruin anything you've drawn. Of course, if you're playing online, that is not an option for you, and there are plenty of pre-made tiles you can find across the web for free or purchase through Roll20 and Fantasy Grounds. And as we get into battle map strategy today, I want you to know where my head's at. I create the majority of my own maps. I really enjoy the process, and it means that I have personally put all the touches in, so I know how they're going to work. So as we dive into map strategy here, if you are using a pre-made map or asset, I want you to think about how you could change it to make it your own, to improve it, to personalize it for your game. And making a good battle map is an exciting part of the game design as a dungeon master. That doesn't mean that it's necessarily a thrilling process. It's a labor of love for your players and your campaign. Don't make the mistake of not entertaining yourself. Put on a podcast, put on a movie while you draw these things. Once the major choices are made, it's more about filling in the rest and laying it out so it's visually representing the church, the town square, the forest that they are in. Drawing 20 trees does get boring. Put on something that will inspire you while you draw these maps. It'll help your sanity and it'll make your map more interesting in the first place. And the first thing we need to discuss when we think about battle map strategy is chokes versus open spaces. Both of these are extremely boring. A choke limits fights, who can participate at a time, mitigates the danger of larger groups, and open spaces allow your players to move freely, to surround your enemy, and make them avoid any tactical choices in the first place. So when you go about designing your battlefield, the first thing you're doing is deciding the general layout of the walls. Do not be seduced into having every wall be the same. A 10-foot corridor over and over is going to lead to the same tactics if you are performing multiple battles within those corridors. If you're going to have a choke, make sure there are additional entrances to that very room or area so that players don't get funneled. The tank doesn't just sit in the choke while the players behind him have nothing to do. And a good rule of thumb here is, the more enemies you have, the more open space they can occupy. 10 hobgoblins spread out in a field is more tactically interesting because of movement, the body blocks they are performing by occupying those squares, and the opportunity attacks that they will get if players try to move among them, whereas one big enemy in a field will lead to a surround and a rather boring flank-based tactic by your players. And in order to change up your chokes and open spaces, you can use multiple shapes. A circular room leading into a square room, a cave that deviates and splits in two, rejoining on the other side, will always be more interesting to players rather than predictable, square, 10-foot wall gaps. And in Season 4 here, it should come as no surprise what your next step of battle map planning is going to be. Think about your players' usual tactics and look through your players' sheets to see if they have a special feature that you can make use of. This could be a forest walk. Your druid is able to avoid difficult terrain in a forest environment. How can you use that? Does your rogue favor flanking in order to get advantage for their sneak attack? They likely have made heavy use of that at this point anyway, but how can you encourage or discourage that play for this particular battle? And at this point, our walls are still undecided. We have one more step, and that is to make sure our monsters get what they want and what they need. Do you have an amphibious creature that has a swim speed, and you'd like to give it some water in the room to take up some of that open space? Do you have a creature with flying that would benefit from having a muddy room? Do you need flank opportunities and secret doors that allow the intelligent creatures in your dungeon to show their intelligence, to make tactical choices, and surprise your players? Can you use the change in terrain style to increase the theming for one of your monsters, moving from geometric workstone walls into more fluid, organic cave walls? And with answering these questions, you should now be sitting on a decent doodle of walls restrictions that your players are going to play within. And now it's time to populate that map with the interesting tidbits that'll make this map different from future maps and past maps. The first thing the Dungeon Master Guide is going to encourage you to do to populate a map would be to add difficult terrain, mud, loose earth, plants, things that are going to restrict movement. In its most simple form, difficult terrain costs twice as much movement to move through. Normally on these maps, we're working with 5-foot squares, so it costs a player 10 feet of movement to move through that area. Your main job when applying difficult terrain to your map is to not be a bummer, and think of it as a way to make your map small. Why have one square of difficult terrain when you could have a 10-foot open area? They're basically the same thing unless one is providing a theme that you feel the monster or the players are going to benefit from. And players do not want to dash. They do not want to spend their movement and their action moving. They want to use their action for action, to have an effect on the battlefield, to get some damage in, to aid an ally. Those are interesting tactical choices. So when you measure out your field and you put difficult terrain in, make sure it is a choice. Make sure it provides an advantage. Jumping over or through the mud actually means they're in a better position, though they could have gone further, going another direction. On the other side of things, players love when enemies are inhibited by difficult terrain, or take their turn dashing. If you want to do a defend the tower scenario, there is nothing wrong with having a really long map and having the monsters run turn after turn towards the tower. It also builds tension as they see future monsters coming down the way at them. But players charging is particularly boring and gruesome as you're basically getting free shots. Don't go wearing down your players with cheap tricks. And to that next note in the Dungeon Master's Guide, traps are great role-playing features. They can be a lot of fun for players to solve a puzzle. In battle, they should be strictly neutral aligned, or should have very clear activation mechanisms. A pit trap should consume just as many players as it does enemies. If a trap is activated like a rolling boulder, then it should be continuous, constantly going throughout the battlefield, taking out both sides equally. And on that note, rolling boulders are really easy to do. Cut out a small round piece of paper, match it to your battle mat, and just drag it back and forth as it moves across the battlefield. What's way more interesting for a battle mat than difficult terrain or traps are interesting features that can be interacted with. And one of these can be obscuring vision. Instead of difficult terrain, put an area where there's a wall of mist or a curtain that the players can move through, with the unknown behind it. Walking in on a lunch table full of orcs is way more interesting than being shot with a couple of arrows from a wall trap. You can also add elevation to make the map more interesting. On the basic level, this would be writing a small 5 foot next to an area that is elevated and maybe enhancing that line, that barrier to the lower ground with a thicker line or different color. You can also have an additional doodle or diagram for the players that shows the terrain from the side, so they're aware of which parts are elevated whenever they're looking at the map as an entire piece. Unless you're going all out with a large set piece that is going to be reused or is a climax of your campaign, it's not worth going with a tunnel or a multi-level building. And for my own sanity, I make sure I never enter Pythagorean territory. A short bow or a basic spell has a safe range of 80 feet. As long as I don't go 80 feet in the air or 80 feet out, I'm not going to get in a confusing triangle math situation with my players and bog down my combat. And think about how your battlefield might change over the course of the battle. What that boulder rolling might do, might destroy, might open up. Do you have a river on your map? Well, what if something was to flow down the river, a bonus item? If the players are using fire spells, what would catch on fire? And can you give a way for your players to overcome the difficult terrain? Either by knocking over a tree that allows them to cross the river, or can they activate some sort of switch that would empty the mud from an area and make a fight better? Those are the type of non-combat actions that you can get your players excited about, and it makes their turns feel worth it. And that knocked over tree to create a bridge, or pressing a button in an ancient temple to extend a bridge, is all the same action. Maybe one requires an Arcana check, one requires a Strength check, but that's just the theming of the battlefield. And that's where your description is really going to become powerful. And to aid your description, you might want to do some decorating. Getting out those different colored pens, drawing around, jumping in Photoshop and changing the color of the set you've bought for your digital tabletop. Those things can help the players keep things in mind. Your opening description, though, is always going to be the most powerful thing you can do. And in that way, if you are capable of it, I really encourage you to leave your battle maps blank until the players enter the space. When they're beholding an entire chamber, they note their own things. They don't know what's important. But when they enter a blank chamber and you immediately start drawing on it in real time, saying there's a throne over here and windows in the back, curtains on the side, pews lined up, and add each of those elements, the picture will come together, and each piece will be an important piece, which is interactable. And that's perhaps the most important advantage of drawing on the go. When you draw a bunch of cruddy, circular, half-square pews, no one is afraid to knock those over, pick one up and swing it. But when they're beautifully drawn, players do have a tendency to think it's a permanent addition to the ground and enjoy the skybox, if we were to use a video game term, but not interact with the environment. And another big advantage of drawing when players enter the room in order to aid your description is that the players can have the entire dungeon laid out on the table, all 4 feet by 3 feet of it, but they don't know which room is important, so they feel compelled to explore them all. For a digital tabletop, you should look into a thing called dynamic lighting. Now, with much of the philosophy of building a good battle map out of the way, let's get to some quick tips before we end. Just like our world maps, you should obey the rules of water, but don't be too concerned with anything else. If you have a river, make sure it goes downhill. If you have a cave, give it some water that actually carved that cave. Players' minds will notice. But in your big evil castle, you don't really need to worry about where the bathroom is, how the plumbing works, whether there are adequate stables for the dragons. It's more important that you have good and interesting game design. If you want your players to fight through the kitchen in order to get to the grand hall, we don't need to worry about the servants' quarters being adjacent to the king's bedroom in that case. Use your space as you need to tell the story you want. When it comes to the Chessex wet erase, I encourage you not to color in anything. If you want to make a big, elegant rug, you want to draw a bunch of bottles on the floor, keep them open shapes. Putting excessive color onto those maps means you have to scrub excessively to get it all up. And in the spirit of being pen efficient, I encourage you to hatch or use hatching in your unplayable areas. These are simple lines that are drawn to indicate that that is a solid wall, that it cannot be passed through. A tip for decorating I like: add something old and add something new. What was this place previously before it was inhabited by monsters, and how have the monsters changed it? If it's an ancient temple, what has been rebuilt or placed in there to make it functional for the current inhabitants? If it is a dangerous lair or tomb, what sort of things can you put in there that encourage a story, a previous adventuring group who failed, or an explorer who lost their way? And the final tip about battle maps: don't forget to keep role-playing your monsters. Brutes still stop to taunt the adventurers. Intelligent bad guys don't enter bad positions. They don't set off traps they're aware of. A dragon on breath weapon recharge might disengage, might fly around, might head up to a roost or elevated terrain and spend their action roaring at the adventurers until they can once again make that breath attack. And one of my favorite things to do is to add a monster that is a tour guide. This might be a magical projection of the final bad guy that watches the players as they move from room to room, or it could be a scared sentry who is running back through the dungeon, having seen the adventurers approach the dungeon. They open doors, activate traps, reveal secret passages, and lead the players through the dungeon, and at the end you have a big build-up for a monster that would have otherwise been simple fodder in an earlier room. And thank you for joining me for today's DM Gives Inspiration on Battle Maps. You can find everything about this show over at kylefergusson.com. You can use the contact link there to send in emails for the future mailbag episodes. You can also support this show over at patreon.com/KyleFergusson. I will see you all next week.